Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Federation of Gay Games' very first talk show, Participation and Inclusion Matters. My name is Shiv Paul. I am the Vice President of External Relations for the Federation of Gay Games. And for anyone listening who doesn't know what the Federation of Gay Games is, it's an organization that owns a quadrennial event called the Gay Games. And that is the world's largest sports and culture event that is put on by LGBTQ people, but which is open to absolutely everybody. So it really is a truly inclusive event. I'm really excited to have some really great guests for this inaugural talk show, where we're going to get into our topic today about how sport can play a bigger part in the inclusion solution. So I'd like to introduce my guests. We have John Amici, OBE, a respected organizational psychologist, best-selling New York Times author, sought-after public speaker, executive coach, and founder of APS Intelligence. John is also the first Briton to have had a career in the NBA. Welcome, John. Very excited for you to be here. Then we have Amazon Letty. Amazon was born in Saigon, where she was left in an orphanage by her mother. She was bullied constantly as a young child because of her ethnicity and sexuality. And it was because of this that she went into bodybuilding at the tender age of 6. She went on to become a competitive natural bodybuilder in her teens, qualifying as a strength and conditioning coach. And during the Obama administration, Amazon helped organize the first Spirit Day collaboration with GLAAD and a White House initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders Act to Change. Welcome, Amazon. Excited for you to be here.
Thank you.
And then we have Zoe Perry, known as Effie. Zoe came out as transsexual while in secondary school at the age of 13 and began to transition in September 2013. So I think you would have been 17, if I'm correct in my calculations there.
Something
Um,
about then, yeah.
uh, uh, Zoe is the first openly transsexual player in British handball history, as well as the first to be a member of the Premier Handball League winning team. She's currently based in Oslo, playing in a Norwegian third division. And since September 2020, she's been a pro ambassador for Athlete Ally, which is a non-profit LGBTQ and athletic advocacy group committed to making athletic communities more inclusive and less discriminatory, and helping athletes to advocate for LGBT plus equality. Amazon is also an Athlete Ally ambassador, as well as an ambassador for many other organizations. So lots of great connections there. Um, I'm going to just go straight into it, folks. As I say, the topic is really around how sport can play a greater part in the inclusion solution. And when you think about the past 14, 15, 16 months, the Black community, Asians, transgender community, women, I feel very much they've all been in the firing line, taking turns to be the brunt of hate speech and actually quite restrictive legislation in a lot of countries quite recently. Now, a lot of this is not new, but I think what is new is the severity with which these communities are being attacked, and the sort of global presence that it is having with everything else that's been happening in the world. So, um, I want to come to you first, John. Why do you think this is happening?
I mean, as you pointed out, Chip, it's not new. So it's not, why are we noticing? Maybe because it's not new, this persecution. I mean, the persecution of Asians in America, for example, is legendary. Internment camps, people seem to forget that that is a thing that existed. And the fact that recently this has happened again, um, it's just not new. The situation for Black and African American people in America and Black people across the world has not changed. And transgender people have never not been the 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 brunt of every joke, the recipient of every kick that seems to go unsanctioned. And so what we are in a position of right now is rulers of countries, of supposedly civilized countries, who are unwilling to speak out against the uncivil behavior, against groups that don't have a seat at the table and a voice. That's really what it is. There's no political opposition of any note there's no substantive corporate response that's creating real action.
So those are really, really great points, and Amazon and Effie, I want to come to you as well. I mean, I think you made a really a good point there where you're talking about the politics of it all, and I think what has changed in the last year and a half is the global political situation. I think these attacks have been exacerbated with what's been happening with COVID and with pandemic. That has really, as much as I think a lot of sections of the world want to believe that we're all in this together and COVID affects everybody and we're all the same. I don't know if that's really necessarily true. I mean, brain tumors can affect anybody as well, and so can aneurysms and things like that. So I think at the same time, it has sort of further marginalized already marginalized communities by throwing a light on the gaps between socioeconomic status or access or legislation and things like that. Amazon, your thoughts about why this is sort of happening with more severity in light of what John just said.
When you think of the Asian community, we've always been used as a scapegoat throughout history for different issues. And, I've been thinking a lot in the past, since early 2020, once the COVID spread across the world, in terms of, why is the Asian community being attacked in this severity? We've always had racism and othering and xenophobia towards our community, but in terms of the way we're being viciously attacked, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, we're literally being now murdered in the street or beaten to a point where we're, in a coma. And, in times of great crisis, particularly governments and communities, we look to a scapegoat. And because this virus came from China, the Asian community have now just been clumped into a monolith group of, we all come from China. We are all to blame for this, everyone's individual pain and suffering. But now, because of the stereotype towards our community that we're seen as passive, geeky, easy targets, we don't speak up, we're also now seen as this very easy target, particularly elderly Asian people. And we've never seen attacks in the way that we have, particularly coming out of the US. And it's just now accelerated because we needed to nip this in the bud early 2020. And now it really is out of control, and governments are scrambling to try and backtrack in terms of what kind of support they can give. But it's happening in real time for our community. We need solutions like in 24 hours because people are getting attacked every single day.
Yeah, that's you're spot on, and as you're talking, really, it's bullying, right? Communities are being bullied. And what do bullies do? They look at the easy targets, and people who you mentioned sort of how Asians have always been perceived and very much the kind of like model minority, right? Toe the party line, don't really rock the boat, sort of assimilate into the rest of society quite easily, all of the kind of stereotypes and other things that we've had before, but then also looking for communities that can't even defend themselves because they don't have the same rights as everybody else, right? And so, I'm thinking, Effie, particularly of the transgender community that has been quite significantly affected by a lot of the legislation that has been coming up, all of these bills that have been passed in the last several weeks. Can you comment a little bit about that and sort of, your own thoughts or experiences of that?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite disheartening in a way to, you wake up every morning and you see yet another American state has introduced legislation for, like checks on like trans youth going to the bathroom, or like having to inspect their lower area so they can play the sport that they want to. It's absolutely mind-blowing to think that, in the 21st century, these things are happening. Like it's everything. I just can't put it in words just how like mind-blowing it is. So I think that, yeah, like I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Like it, even just thinking about it now, it makes me emotional because I think, how can somebody do this? You know, like trans people have existed in sports like long before this. It might not have been as publicized, but like, you know, trans people have always existed. So only, you know, in the past maybe, you know, like 2 years or so, you know, this spotlight is being shone on it, and all of these like negative like voices are starting to comment on it. And I think as a community, the best that we can do is, you know, just kind of, you know, keep the positivity and, you know, combat this, and yeah, just make it right for, you know, like for the next generation. You know, like I said, you know, these trans youth that are affected by these, you know, these awful bills that are coming through.
Yeah, no, really pertinent points there. And you know, I have to say that that's one of the reasons that I really love the gay games. You know, my very first games was in Cologne in 2010, and I think when you're part of the LGBTQ community, it's often quite easy to feel quite disconnected from the other members of of your own, you know, communities. But I remember when I went to Cologne, I was blown away. I was just not expecting it to be one the size that it was, but the kind of community feel was new to me as well. And you know, you literally have uh, one person representing a country where it's criminal to be LGBTQ, and you know that they're going to be attacked. And I always find it very moving because for those 7 days, people are just able to be who they actually really want to be. And when you see that, particularly in volume, the reason I always get really emotional is I'm just always thinking, why is that so offensive to people? Why is it so offensive that people just want to be their authentic selves? So, you know, I'm right on the money there. I think the other thing that's interesting for me, which has surfaced, and I'd love to get your, you know, your thoughts on it, all of you, is when you know, marginalized communities, let's say, have been tolerated over, you know, long periods of time, and it's sort of as long as you kind of stay in your lane, you know, that's fine. We're happy to kind of, you know, tolerate your existence or, you know, accept and those sorts of things. But actually, when you think about the concept of intersectionality, um, the components that make up our identity are so varied and so broad. You know, myself, I was born in India. I'm of Indian origin. I grew up in the UK. I've been living in the States. I'm a gay man. You know, I love sports. All of those things are parts of who you know make up who I am. My question is, um, when we think about the communities that are being attacked, you know, how can they work together more effectively to make change? You know, Amazon, you were talking about us needing solutions. You know, how can they work together to provide protection for each other, and also, you know, for other communities that are going to be in the firing line coming up? Thoughts?
I think what's happened in terms of the BLM movements and the anti-Asian hate, particularly in the US, you know, we need to look to our history. You know, in the US, there's been a long-standing history of Asian and Black solidarity, and you saw this, you know, with the rise of the BLM movement last year, of how many Asian leaders and Asian people in the community and organizations came out and stood alongside the Black community and marched with them. You know, we've seen now with the anti-Asian hate how, you know, the Black community is now there for us in a way we hadn't seen before, because we realized that, you know, we're both being, both of our communities are being persecuted by the, you know, white supremacy, by the one major community. Even though the way we're being persecuted is different, the pain and the trauma that we're suffering is both the same. And we realize that, you know, we're stronger together than we are apart. And when I think of what's been going on with the anti-trans bills across the US, I don't believe the legislators and the politicians in the states realized how much all communities are prepared to rally around trans youth. They were so surprised. I think they really thought that they could pass these bills. No one would care about a 6-year-old trans girl wanting to play sports. But then they realized everyone around in the US, around the world, has started to rally around. Unfortunately, some of these bills have gone through, but they've realized there's been such a massive pushback. And I think we've found this I feel the silver lining through all this pain and trauma in this time is that we found unity with each other in a way that we didn't find before the pandemic. And I think moving forward, our communities will look at what advocacy means to our communities and then collectively.
Yeah, that's great. What do you think? Or let me rephrase that question, actually. I'm gathering my thoughts. We're here to talk about sport and how sport can play a bigger part in the inclusion solution. What do you all think? You're all athletes, all working in the industry. What role should the sports industry play in being part of that inclusion solution? We've seen some major sports organizations boycotting events, pulling their events out of cities that support restrictive legislation, for example, and things like that. Do we agree with that? And what more do we think that the sports industry should be doing to provide solutions for these communities?
I'll go. I think in like at the time we live in, I think the best way to kind of get these things across, unfortunately, is to kind of hit them in the pockets. We've seen like the NCAA has, considered taking tournaments out of states that pass this, unfortunately, because of like I said, the times we live in, that's what's going to make these people in charge take notice, who are backing these legislations, because at the end of the day, it's their pockets that get hit. So I think they will. I think that is probably the best way that they're going to listen at this present time.
John, Amazon, do you agree with that?
I absolutely do. I think, sports organizations, just like companies, have a responsibility to champion equality in the cities, the states, and the countries that they work in. And they have this platform that, and I think, coming out of the pandemic, what does the brave new world look like that we want? And, sports has the power to change the world. It's a language that everyone understands. And I think states need to realize the ramifications when they pass anti-trans bills, that, they can't then have these major sports events because they're not allowing everyone to participate in their games.
The FE and Amazon are right, but it's not really a question of whether we believe it's right or not, or whether we think it's political or not. It's completely irrelevant. This is what sport itself says. The Olympics. The goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of humankind with the preservation of human dignity. The practice of sport is a human right. The enjoyment and rights and freedoms set forth in the Olympic Charter are secured without discrimination of any kind. FIFA. Safeguarding the dignity of the individual is a fundamental requirement. Sorry, this is FIBA, the International Federation for Basketball. There should be no discrimination between participants on the basis of anything. FIFA will reflect the world and the communities within it, where it operates. I mean, it goes on and on and on. This is not a question of activists demanding sports do stuff in the face of politics. This is a question of sport behaving congruently with its own principles. That's it. It isn't about us, none of us. It's not about gay people or trans people or Asians or black people. It's not about any of us. It's not about corrupt police. It's about the internal validity of an organization's own principles as written down in documents that are chartered. That's it. And the truth is, for everything we can cite, the NCAA is a modern day plantation. So everything it does good in terms of its Indiana boycott, brilliant. But then on the other side, it's got a bunch of black kids who are constantly exploited and don't get paid for it. I mean, where else have you heard the narrative? Come here, we'll give you a place to live, we'll give you some food and maybe a bit of education, and you can work for us. We've heard that before. So I just think we have to be really clear that this is about the internal validity of the principles. And when we demand stuff, it isn't because we're activists for LGBTQ people. It isn't because we're advocates for Black Lives Matter or for Asian lives. It's because we're advocates for the upholding of principles, I think.
I really like what you just said there, because it is sort of something that I sort of personally wrestle with. You know, I also agree with what much of what's being said here. But then when I think about, you know, our organization of the Gay Games, you know, we're going to Hong Kong in 2022, and as the VP of External Relations, you know, I manage the marketing committee, the communications committee. Obviously, I'm getting a lot of interaction and communications from people who are questioning why we're going there. And I think it's sort of quite aligned with what you were saying. I mean, you know, us as an organization, what we can do is we can show up in numbers in territories where our communities are perhaps being more marginalized than in other areas of the world, and at least give them a voice, and at least for a period of time allow them to feel truly included and truly authentic. You know, I think in that sense, the first step is to show up, right, and at least provide an environment where people can be themselves and can sort of, you know, enjoy that with everyone else. It's interesting what you were saying about that separation of sport from politics, John. You know, these are the principles of sport, right? And I think sport has always wanted to separate itself from politics, but I feel more and more and more those lines are getting blurred, aren't they? So
No, sport has
no.
never wanted to separate itself from politics. Sport has never wanted to separate itself from politics. It has wanted to be seen to be apolitical. That is not the same thing. Because it's
Okay.
not apolitical, because all you have to do is go and watch as prime ministers, presidents, kings bow down to IOC officials, attempting to beg them to come to their country to host events. All you have to do is look at the machinations in the background of the sports business world and realize just how politically connected it is. A few football teams in England want to go off and form their own league, and all of a sudden the prime minister's interested. And I turn around and I wonder why we've got people who lost their homes and their families in Grenfell who still haven't got new houses yet. So sports has always been inherently political, and we make a mockery of it by pretending it's not. Since that first man ran the original marathon, and then popped his clogs at the end, that was to give a message about victory in war. That was inherently political.
Interesting.
And it's been political since that day. Anytime anybody says it shouldn't be political, what they really mean is we don't want to be held accountable for the things that we're doing.
Interesting. Do we think it's going to get worse before it gets better? John's nodding Amazon too. Why do we think that? Tell me.
I mean, when you look at what's happening with the Asian community, it's already got worse. It's already out of control there. You know, I mean, particularly places like New York and parts of California, even though it's happening all across the US and around the world, you know, there are particular hotspots where, you know, when I think, gosh, it's not even safe for me to be in those places. The local legislators have even said themselves, when we look at what's happening in the US, that, you know, this is a retaliation and a continually conversation of what happened with the Trump administration. And it's unfortunate to say that it has got worse before it got better. I mean, we just had a month ago the mass shooting in Atlanta where Asian women were targeted. We never thought it would get that bad.
Effie, your thoughts?
Yeah, kind of just following on from that, I do think it may get worse before it gets better. In a way, kind of feels like, this could be, like a generational thing. Like, as a society, we need to kind of, teach ourselves again that, all people are valid to, play sport, to be who they want to be. No one should really be, discriminated for their, who they are, or their, the color of the skin, or, their heritage. Yeah, it could be worse before it gets better. I'm always optimistic and hope it won't be, but like, you see the way things are, and yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. So we're
Shiv,
into the
can I
last. Yes, please tell
just
me.
say so this doesn't have to be like super negative, but it is. I often wonder, for trans communities, I just wonder. Sometimes they listen to conversations about this and roll their eyes because look at the LGBT community, such as it is, and we've got some navel gazing to do. We've got some looking in at ourselves because if we want to improve the culture, that is determined by the worst behavior each of us tolerates. How many anti-trans kind of jokes do you hear in and around communities of gay people? How many racist comments about people who are attracted to Asians, or stereotypes about Asians, or stereotypes around Black people do you hear within our own communities? And in the broader context of this, we will define how bad it gets before it gets good by each of us. What is the worst behavior we tolerate? After you've watched this, after whoever watches this, you will listen to somebody. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's somebody you like, maybe it's somebody at work. They will say something. What will you do? It doesn't mean you have to light the room on fire, but are you going to challenge the narrative or not? When somebody misgenders somebody, are you going to challenge that? The thing that happened the other day where a woman who was a doctor, was asked to be called her name, Dr. somebody, and they refused. Is anybody going to say anything? If somebody makes a joke about an Asian, is anybody going to say anything? And if it's too uncomfortable, then yes, it'll get worse before it gets better.
And I think essentially what you're talking about at the end of the day, in terms of making cultural change, that in great part is tied to having a high level of emotional intelligence, right? Increasing your emotional intelligence comes from increasing your level of self-awareness. Increasing your level of self-awareness comes from checking your thoughts, your biases, recognizing those and asking yourself, okay, why do I think this? And before you're reacting to that, really approaching it with some analysis and intelligence. But the other thing that you just mentioned is, you're talking about accountability, right? Are we going to hold people accountable for things that they're saying? But we have to start by holding ourselves accountable, right? Are we actually going to sort of, if we know what our values are and our value set is, are we actually really going to live by that and abide by that? And, I think that can be a scary undertaking for a lot of people. And my whole corporate career was in management consulting. So I've seen this at the organizational level as well. In order to make that change, you really need to look under the hood, right? That comes with introspection, that comes with vulnerability, but the rewards of going through that are so rich. Uh, but I think people are immediately kind of afraid to go down that path because it does require a huge level of honesty, starting with yourself. So we've got last couple of minutes. I would love to get some closing thoughts and comments from you. What can sport do to kind of move the needle and make change? What can we do, to move the needle and make change? John, you were talking about communities needing to make change. No one kind of owns the community, right? We collectively do. So what parting advice or thoughts or solutions would the three of you have for our listeners in order to start making change immediately? John, I'll go to you first.
Sport needs to facilitate its own athletes who fight against incivility rather than block. No more of these declarations of no taking the knee, all of this nonsense. Sport needs to state where it stands on issues of importance, on racism, Are you against racism? Are you anti-racist? I mean, even as you say this, how ridiculous does that sound? I'm against racism. It shouldn't be too hard to say. I'm against the persecution of trans people. Shouldn't be too hard to say. I'm against the murder of Asian people and the subjugation of X and Y. It's just not hard.
Yeah.
If they stated that and declared them as their core principles as they are already written, we would be able to hold them to account for that.
Yeah. I love that. It's, you know, what you're saying is, it's, in my mind, it's akin to saying, I'm against the rationing of oxygen for certain communities that live on the planet, or I'm against, you know, we can only allow certain amount of sun time for people in the world. You know, when you think about it in those terms, actually does become really quite a ridiculous question. Amazon, your closing thoughts.
I think really just following on what John said is that, you know, they need to uphold their own mission and vision and hold themselves accountable, because you can't say, well, we uphold anti-discrimination and anti-racism, but then that one Asian player they have has suffered, you know, a lifetime of racism by their peers and nothing happens. And I think, you know, when we talk about culture, we also need to think about the language as well. I think, you know, sports media needs to hold themselves accountable in terms of the narratives around trans athletes, around Black and Asian athletes as well, because so many of us, that's who we learn about a trans person for the first time, or an Asian person, or a Black person, or someone else from the media. But if negative spins are already, you know, pushed in that person's way continually, then it becomes that truth to that person who's never met that person.
Absolutely. Yeah, spot on. That's absolutely true. And we see that a lot just with the sexism in sport, right? You know, female athletes versus male athletes. Effie, your parting comments.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these guys put it absolutely perfect, you know, kind of what John said, you know, it's crazy to think that, you know, making a stand for these things, you know, saying, you know, I'm anti-racist and everything. It's crazy to think that that's considered like outlandish when, you know, like you all said, you know, these are, you know, these should be core things. And kind of what Amazon said as well. You know, sports media does have to do better. You know, we need to see these, you know, positive stories about Black athletes, Asian athletes, trans athletes. We need to see these, you know, these stories amplified. You know, no negative kind of spins on anything. You know, we need to put these positive stories out there so that, you know, the next generation after all of us can, you know, look at it and go, okay, you know, we can play sport, and this can be a safe space for us to, you know, express ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would just say I agree with everything that everyone's just said. If there are a few takeaways people can take, all of your points are really valid. I would say, you know, be curious about yourself and about others. I always say, don't be afraid to ask the dumb questions. I'm always saying that I'm asking dumb questions in an effort to learn and to course correct and to be better, and make a visible commitment. You know, I think everything that you said, coupled with those items, I think can really help to facilitate change. John Amici, Amazon Letty, Effie Perry, thank you so much for being part of this show. I found it really fascinating. I hope everybody watching and listening will as well. And I wish you a great, inclusive and diverse day. Thank you.